So, excellent. Welcome everyone to The Truth About Bread, Slicing Fact from Fiction. And yes, Naomi did come up with that pun. Well done, Naomi. Very good stuff. I can't take credit for that. And yeah, today we're going to be talking all about bread, the science of bread, the nutrition of bread. And yeah, before I pass on to Naomi, just a few logistics and house rules. First, to let you all know, there's 72 of you here right now, which is brilliant. Thanks so much for coming out. Oh, by the way, I should probably introduce. My name is Robbie. You might have seen me before. I'm one of the nutritionists and content designers here at Second Nature. And yeah, just so you all know, we can't see or hear you. So feel free to eat your dinner, do whatever you need to do whilst you're watching this. Maybe you want to cook or whatever, that's all good. If the dogs start barking in the background, don't worry, we can't hear you. And this will be recorded. So after today, if you want the recording, don't worry, it will be coming out on our social media pages. It just takes a bit of time to download onto our cloud. Then we have to upload it to YouTube, which I'll normally do tomorrow. So it might be online by tomorrow and we might post it sometime next week. Or if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Second Nature Health, you can do that and be the first people to get notified. But anyway, I think without further ado, let's do a bit of let's go around the room and do some introductions. Naomi, before we get to you as the host, as the person delivering the webinar, maybe we go to Tash first. Tash, would you mind just introducing yourself? I'm sure everyone knows who you are by now, but.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Natasha. I am one of the health coaches and nutritionists here at Second Nature as well. I've been here about 4.5 years, and yeah, I also run a lot of the webinars with Robbie, and I am super excited about this webinar this evening.
Excellent. Sweet, thanks Tash. And Naomi, I'll hand it over to you. I'll let you do your introductions and crack on from here. If you see me leave the room, by the way, I forgot to top up my glass of water, so I'm not leaving. I will come back. I'm just going to get some water, but I'll be right back. So Naomi, over to you.
Great, thanks Robbie. Yeah, hi everybody. So my name's Naomi and I'm one of the health coaches here and a registered associate nutritionist and really passionate about bread. So it's a personal interest of mine because my first ever job was actually in a bakery where they baked fresh bread every day and then at the end of the day gave it away to charity. And then also in April 2020, like many people, started my own sourdough starter and have been baking sourdough bread ever since. And that's still going strong. So I do love bread and I want to share my passion with you. But I also want to encourage us all to think about how we can make bread as part of our lives in a balanced way. And yeah, there is a lot to unpack. So without further ado, we're going to be slicing fact from fiction. And today's topics will be looking at how bread unites us culturally and globally, how bread nourishes us physically, how it nurtures us psychologically, and lastly, how it enables us to make informed, healthy choices as consumers. And then there'll be time just at the end for any questions you might have. So do get them. I think there's a question section, isn't there, to be submitting those. So we'll come to that as a separate section at the end. So firstly, how bread unites us. We'll be looking at culture and history, and important to consider how bread fits really into our wider global context. But I will create a word of warning that these next few images might increase your hunger levels. So we'll start by looking culturally and considering that we can't ignore how much of an essential part bread really is to our culture and diets. It's fed humans across generations through various forms, developed in hundreds of different varieties. And so we probably recognize a few of these products as different countries have then exported their types of bread to different areas. So we have the French baguette, we have Italian focaccia, German pumpernickel, Mexican tortillas, or Chinese steamed buns. But also bread is traditional and it's often associated with some religious festivals and rituals. So there's challah bread, which is eaten during Hanukkah in the Jewish tradition. And Christians also share the Lord's Supper or communion by sharing and distributing bread as part of their religious gathering. But also other aspects of tradition here would refer to the unique ways of baking and fermenting bread. So in Iceland, for example, they make rugabrau, which is buried in a tin underground, and then it's baked by the boiling water of the steam generated by geothermal springs. And then it's left for 24 hours and they create the most amazing dense rye bread. And then in Ethiopia, they make this large fermented pancake called injera, and they place all of the delicious curries and sauces on top, and then they share it around the table. And lastly, part of culture, bread is celebratory. So in Sweden, they have something called the smörgåstårta, or sandwich cake. And this was recently a showstopper challenge on the Great British Bake Off. I just love the idea of like having a savory cake for celebrations. Perhaps this is something you might like to try as well. Or what about the classic British hot cross bun at Easter coming up soon for us? It's an example of an enriched dough, meaning there's been added fat. And for that reason, it absolutely tastes amazing when toasted. So that's some of the culture, but then what about the history? So I want to share just a few key dates because are specific to the UK, and this is important just in understanding our modern environment for bread, how we consume it and how it relates to our health. And all of these dates and information is actually available on the Federation of Bakers website. So we're starting with 1266, and there was something called the Assize of Bread, which was a governing body to help regulate the weight and price of loaves. And if a baker broke this law, he could be publicly ridiculed and banned from baking for life. And then if we jump to 1666, it might be a familiar date to you, the Great Fire of London. It was said to have been started by a baker, and it totally destroyed the milling and baking industry in the capital. And then now into the 18th century, there was a report that accused bakers of adulterating their bread using alum lime, chalk, and powdered bones to keep it looking really white. And so Parliament banned alum and all these other additives in bread, but there were still some bakers that just ignored this ban. And then in 1846, there are large groups of the population near to starvation. So the corn laws were repealed, and duty on imported grain was then removed, which meant that importing good quality North American wheat then enabled white bread to be made at a more reasonable cost. And so together, alongside the introduction of the roller mill, this led to an increased general consumption of white bread when it was otherwise more associated with aristocracy. And then a century later, the Federation of Bakers was formed, and this was to assist in organizing wartime production and distribution of bread. And so something called the national loaf was introduced due to the shortage of shipping space for white flour, and this became the healthy staple in the country. But then only by 1956, the national loaf was then abolished. And laws at this time were then introduced whereby all the other flours other than wholemeal had to now be fortified with minimum amounts of calcium, iron, vitamin B1 and vitamin B3. And then by 1965, we have the Chorley wood bread process, which came into general use. It had first been developed in 1961, but it meant that now there was a really rapid increase in popularity for sliced and wrapped bread in the UK. And it's now, at this point, they're able to produce it much more efficiently and cost effectively on mass scale. And then the last date I would just want to highlight is 2008. So we're now about 750 years later from the appearance of that bread weights legislation in the UK. And it was finally then abolished by an EU directive. So bread could now be sold in all sizes and weights. And we now have different size loaves. But until this legislation changed, the requirement that was bread was sold in the UK in weights of 400 grams or so. So yeah, just a little bit of the history. Throughout the webinar, I then want to stop and pause after each section just to give us a chance to be reflecting on some of this information for ourselves. And do share any questions you have, but we primarily want you just be reflecting in your own time or in the chat. So what is your cultural history with bread? Have there been any bakers in your family? What culture do you come from, and what are the breads that are associated with it? So it'd be great just to take a moment on this, and feel free to share any stories in the chat as well. So then we'll move on just to the second section now. So how bread nourishes us. And we'll be covering the different processes of making bread and the flour used to bake it. We'll touch on some of the health benefits as well as intolerances, and then look at how we can begin to change our relationship with bread for the better. So when we looked at the history there, it's been centuries of bread baking in its more traditional form, like these lovely golden loaves. And there are still other parts of the world that still prioritize this in an authentic way. And I think France comes to mind for many of us as being a prime example of that, with all of their boulangerie. And so it's only in recent years that we've now opted for more speed, convenience, and processing. And so the dominant type of bread in the UK now is primarily sliced and bagged. And there's an overwhelming amount of choice in supermarkets, meaning it's often at bargain prices, and we have so many different things to consider and navigate. So if you think about it, we've gone from just those simple ingredients, flour, water, salt, and yeast, baked by local businesses or home bakers, to this more convenient process of longer shelf life, increased additives or preservatives, and unfortunately also higher amounts of waste. So it might not surprise you then that ever since that Chorley wood process came into use in the 1960s, we've seen this massive rise in large plant bakeries or factories that are really dominating the market. And so now it's a £4 billion industry employing 75,000 people and supplying 85% of the nation's bread. And compare that with the other bakers. So in-store is only 12% of that share. And in-store means the supermarket's own bakeries. And quite often these large plant bakeries will actually supply the dough frozen to bake within stores. They still have as part of that market share. And then it's just a 3% slice for the high street bakeries, which could include some chains, but it's primarily the independent bakeries out there. So now with all of this overproduction and consumption, bread is actually now the second most wasted food product in UK homes. And it's actually estimated that around 20 million whole slices of bread is thrown out at home every day, which are pretty shocking numbers. But regardless of the bread baking process in this way, it all really starts with grains being turned into flour. And understanding this more will clearly help us make more informed choices about the bread that we're consuming and its impact on our health. So we'll start just with the grains. Wheat is the most popular grain option for bread today. There are so many other types of grains that you can still grind into flour and bake bread into, such as rye or oat. And then the most popular process for separating the grain out is now roller milled, developed in the 19th century, which makes it easier to actually create that refined white flour. And that's by removing that nutritious bran or germ from the grain and just leaving that starchy endosperm center. And while it does mean some loss of nutrients compared to the more traditional stone ground method, we can still gain wholemeal flours with that roller mill process. And so just touching then on the different types of flours that are created, there's often some confusion around these terms. So I'll do my best to try and explain the differences. So we have white refined flour. Then wholemeal is referring to the flour that's formed when you're using the entire whole grain of any grain product. So you can have wholemeal wheat flour, but also wholemeal rye or wholemeal spelt, for example. And then whole grain is often actually used interchangeably with wholemeal. So that's maybe where the confusion comes. But it also could refer to whole grains being present in the loaf, such as use of spelt or oat flakes on top of the dough. And also when we describe a healthy diet as containing whole grains, then it's often referring to including eating things in their entirety rather than the flour form, so like oats, spelt, or rice as a grain. Then whole wheat is specifically referring to the use of the entire wheat grain into flour and not any other grains. And then finally, brown bread. So this might be the term that we're actually using to refer to all of the other ones except for white flour. But you've got to be careful because it could also refer to white flour bread that has actually been coloured with a dye. Often it's a caramel that's added. So this is why, and we'll be coming to this later in the session, reading food labels is really important and not just assuming that brown means healthy. So looking now into some of the health benefits, bread nourishes us and it's through various health benefits. We'll begin with actually fibre. And so whole grain flour that still contains both the bran and the germ of the grain not being removed, means it's providing fiber, which helps to move food through our digestive system. It removes any waste products, and it helps us maintain the good bacteria in our gut that ferments and feeds on the insoluble fiber because it can't be absorbed. And that just leads to a more healthy gut microbiome with so many health benefits from that. Then we have the idea behind fermentation and easier digestion. So another benefit to gut health is the idea of a fermentation process, and sourdough bread is a great example of this, where that long fermentation process creates more of an acidic bread and again has benefits to our digestive system. So with it, the naturally occurring yeast and bacteria cultures that are found in the sourdough starters feed on the sugar in the flour, and they break down the gluten, forming more lactic acid, and then making that final bread product more easily digestible. And then the key nutrients in the flours used are also then more bioavailable for absorption into the body. And lastly, fortification. So remember how after the end of the national loaf in 1956, the new regulations then required that all the flours be fortified to restore their nutritional value. And wholemeal didn't need that because it already actually naturally contains adequate levels of vitamin B1 or thiamine, vitamin B3 or niacin, and iron and calcium. It is a bit ironic or funny that calcium's now being added to the flours when we consider the bakers in the 18th century who were adding powdered bones to make their flours more white. And now we add calcium to support better bone health. And I just want to touch then on some of the intolerances. I think it's really important to recognize there are people with intolerances and symptoms from certain grains, particularly those containing gluten, which affects people with celiac disease, or some people might experience some certain allergies to wheat or other grains, or just severe bloating or irritable bowel syndrome. But if that's the case, then it's probably a good idea to seek more support from a registered dietitian, someone who specializes in these sorts of medical conditions, and get advice for a diet that will help with that. But unless you've noticed any signs of an intolerance for yourself or you have a diagnosis, then you can safely assume that it's okay to enjoy bread products in your diet. And if you're on the Second Nature program already, then you can always speak to your health coach about how you can incorporate bread into your diet. The next part of health I want to touch on is the idea of blood sugars. Second Nature is actually part of the National Diabetes Prevention Programme, and so our recommendations align with a lot of the latest evidence suggesting that lower carbohydrate diets are more effective at reducing blood glucose levels. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to eliminate carbohydrates altogether, but rather it's important at looking at the types and the quantities of what you're eating, and in particular, reducing the intake of any refined or ultra-processed foods. So we'll just take a moment to look at this cycle and review what happens when we eat carbohydrates. So carbohydrates go in, they're consumed, digested, and then this means a release of glucose into the bloodstream. And then as a result, we actually need more insulin to get that glucose moved over into the cells. And then this increased insulin response can lead to increased fat storage and weight gain if there's a surplus of energy. And so having a lower carbohydrate diet means this effectively is reducing this kind of cycle. It's better at reducing overall blood glucose levels. It improves insulin control and then leads to more sustainable weight loss because fat's now being used for energy instead of being stored. And the benefit of choosing either whole grain or sourdough bread options will have a positive effect on this blood sugar cycle due to either the fiber or the fermentation and the impact on the digestive system and the uptake of glucose into the blood or cells. But also important to remember the idea of a balanced plate. And so the addition of protein or fat in the meal alongside these sources of carbohydrates also helps slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream during digestion. So it's really not about cutting out carbohydrates altogether, but we'll look in a bit about how we can incorporate them into our balanced diet. And lastly, when it comes to our overall health, we need to not only just consider the physical benefits of the food we eat and how it impacts us physiologically, but also the psychological benefits of connecting with our food, which means actually healing our relationship with food overall, but in particular with bread. And we do, as health coaches, hear a lot of times people cutting it out completely. And so our hope from this webinar is really to emphasize that that's not necessary. And we'll go through some of the reasons why. So I just wonder if any of you can relate to these statements as we go through them. So bread makes me feel bloated and uncomfortable. I'm starting a diet, so giving up bread. Or I love bread, but if I have one slice, I won't be able to stop. I wonder if any of these resonate with you, and maybe you in the chat want to just be sharing some other statements that you have said or thought in the past, or if you can relate to any of these. And we always say at Second Nature, there are no bad foods. Everything can be enjoyed mindfully. So really it's about how we're seeing bread crossing cultural divides, and it's part of traditions and celebrations. And really it's then unhelpful, isn't it? If we're having a healthy lifestyle journey and cutting them out, we really don't want to be demonizing these whole food groups when it's such an essential part of our culture. So instead, I want to just suggest some ways that we can reframe these statements. And with the first one, it's really about considering, is it the type, quality, or quantity of the bread that is causing these symptoms of bloating? And maybe it is that you need to investigate a bit of an intolerance, but it might not be bread as an overall category, but it's more just the kind of bread you're choosing. Then with the second statement, whenever the word diet crops up, it's often things like bread and pasta that are the first things to be avoided. But we want to just ask, is that really necessary to cut it out completely? And could you find a balance there? And then lastly, the idea of not being able to stop after one slice and then just being deciding that even though you love bread, you're cutting it out completely. Let's think about an opportunity there to actually start connecting with our bread in a more mindful way. And that's actually something we'll explore just in this next section. But I want to pause once again and ask you to reflect on your health and bread. So have you noticed how you feel when eating bread? Do you think the type of bread you've been eating makes a difference to your health? And what's your relationship with bread like? So let's move on just to the next section as you reflect on that, but we'll come back at the end. We're looking at how bread nurtures us and focusing on mindfulness and community, which means going beyond just the physical benefits and looking instead at how we can bring about more mindfulness and build community. So when we think of nurturing, we think of ways that we can be more self-compassionate. And that means we're noticing those moments where we might be led to more emotional eating. We're seeking bread or starchy sweet foods as a source of comfort. And part of the process then is now challenging and changing these experiences through establishing the art of mindfulness. So I want to just walk us through some ways that we can engage our five senses with bread mindfully. The first is seeing. So what is the shape and texture of the dough that you're working with, or the loaf, or even the crumb texture? What do you see? The second is smell. So nothing quite beats the smell of freshly baked bread if anyone's had it in their home and baked a loaf. And what are you noticing when you're cutting into it, or perhaps when you're opening the bag of bread you've bought from the supermarket? What is the smell? Then feel. So if you're kneading dough, it's got an amazing feel to it. But also if you're cutting into a loaf, what are some of the feelings physically, but also maybe as you're connecting with it, how are you feeling emotionally as well? Hearing, is there a pounding on the table as you're kneading the dough and shaping it? Or if you're cutting into a loaf, is there that really lovely crunchy crust as you're using the knife into the dough? And so what do you hear? And lastly, what about taste? So most important, I think, what are the unique flavors? Do you notice the way that the other foods that you've paired that bread with are changing its flavor? What changes do you notice with fresh versus toasted bread? In my opinion, nothing quite beats the taste of a freshly baked sourdough loaf. It could be then toasted and smothered with butter. And so how are you noticing some of the ways that bread can be satisfying in that way? But also with community. So the idea behind bread nurturing us goes beyond just our personal relationship with eating, baking, or buying bread, but it's also about how we're restoring relationship with other people and with our planet too. So I want to just share some pretty cool examples about how this is happening. And the first is something called the Sourdough School. It was started by author and baker Vanessa Kimball in Northamptonshire. And as well as offering courses in sourdough bread baking that you can sign up for, they actually have this amazing program where GPs and other healthcare providers are trained at the school, and then they can socially prescribe an invitation for their patients to join the club as part of a Baking as Lifestyle Medicine membership. So they're using it as a bit of therapy for chronic health conditions. The next example to share is the Bread Therapy Network. They have a mission to help drive positive social change and to help nurture creativity and inclusion in communities around the world. So people from all walks of life and abilities are physically kneading dough in the same large bowl around the table together, and it's helping to foster stronger community. And this form of high-touch bread baking has now actually been recognised as a form of art therapy. And lastly, the Real Bread campaign. So they're working to find and share ways of making bread better for us, better for our communities and the planet. They define real bread as made without chemical raising agents or any other additives. And so the campaign is involving advocacy work at the government level for policy changes, but it also goes all the way down to supporting local independent bakeries. And remember that 3% slice of the UK market share. So there's a big portion of that they want to really focus on increasing. So we'll pause again for you to just take a moment to reflect on your connection with bread. So have you considered the ways that bread might support improving your connection with mindfulness or with community? And what do you think about learning to bake some bread as a form of therapy? So the final section we'll look at together is how bread enables us, and we'll be focusing on sharing some tips about buying and storing bread and looking at the Second Nature Balance plate model and some recipe ideas. So some tips for buying bread then. We always advise reading food labels of all products. So when it comes to bread, you want to be choosing something that says wholemeal or whole grain flour as the main ingredient in the list. And generally bread that contains about 15 to 20% grains in the ingredients list would be considered high quality. And it's also considered high in fiber if there's more than 9 grams of fiber per 100 grams. You also want to keep in mind you want to avoid any added sugars. Remember the caramel making brown bread that color, but it actually is just white flour. Think about any preservatives that are added or any ingredients generally that are just hard to pronounce and you wouldn't normally include when baking. Sourdough is also another healthy option, but traditional sourdough is actually made without any added yeast. So even when you're buying it, you do want to try and look for a sourdough without yeast listed in the ingredients list. And that would mean then you're getting the most benefits from an authentic, slower fermentation process. We also want to be wary of any marketing words that are often used without regulation these days. So things like healthy, high fiber, gluten-free, vegan. Again, they might be genuine, but you want to be not only caught up in the marketing of it, but checking the food label. And especially be mindful when opting for gluten-free products. It's understandable if you have disease or intolerance to it to be choosing those items, but trying to go as additive-free or reduced as you can. Because labeling gluten-free doesn't always mean it's going to be the healthier option. And then lastly, when it comes to buying bread, we want to be looking at some bargains these days because the cost of living is going up, and we understand that, bread is already sold fairly cheaply, but everyone does love a bargain. So you can be looking out for those loaves, but just consider the quality of the loaf on offer and that you're not just buying something because it's on sale, but consider what is actually a healthier option. Then tips for storing bread. Those bargains are often because the supermarkets pack their shelves and bread does then spoil. So it's often why they're on offer. But best before dates don't necessarily mean use by dates. So the bread is still edible. You can take it home and enjoy a few slices still, but then also consider that maybe you can freeze the bread and then it pops into the toaster and defrosts and toasts really nicely. So that's a great option of saving some bread for adding to any meal. You could also blend up some stale slices of bread into breadcrumbs and use those in some recipes. And then generally any bread loaf is ideally kept at room temperature on the countertop without exposure to air. So either keeping it in a sealed bag or a bread bin, and this will just help to keep it fresher for longer. And as it's been said on the slide there, the 20 million slices thrown away in UK homes daily. Generally, these tips for buying and storing bread will hopefully start to reduce some of the wastage in homes. And especially for you getting the most out of the purchases you're making, especially if you are spending a little bit more on those high quality, fresh loaves. This is obviously some good ideas of how to store and buy those things. Let's just look then at our balanced plate model. We recommend at Second Nature for all meals to be made up of a combination of 50% vegetables, 25% being a good source of protein, at least one serving of fat, and then the option of adding carbohydrates to the other quarter of that meal. And a typical serving size for bread we recommend is about one thin slice of bread, or it ranges between 50 to 70 grams. And that does also depend just on the size of the loaf. So sometimes you get sourdoughs that can be this big, or you're thinking of, the classic square. And then also, I've mentioned flatbreads exist as well, like the injera. So one tortilla wrap would be a quarter of the plate worth as well. So the aim is looking at balance within the meal, but also you want to think about balance across your day or week. So it's really about using your own judgment there, noticing, do you feel any symptoms of an intolerance? Consider how active you're being during the day, and do you need actually just a bit more carbohydrates in your meals? And then what are some of the other carbohydrate source varieties that you're including? And remember, you can choose whole grains from any source. And the preference generally is to be opting for whole grain or sourdough breads primarily. So you want to be swapping from the white refined loaves and choosing more whole meal flour if you're doing any home cooking or baking. And I just want to remind us again, there aren't any bad foods and everything has its place within an eating plan. So there might be occasions where you're going to enjoy just a lovely fresh white roll or a hot cross bun, and that's okay. We're looking at really generally what are we choosing to consume in our diets, but we want to also remember that food is traditional, it's celebratory, it's cultural, it's global. And so those lovely tasty foods that you perhaps are trying to avoid for the sake of being on a diet, which we just don't ever want to recommend here. Instead, how can you incorporate it just as an occasional food, and how is it bringing you joy? And I just want to end then with some Second Nature recipe suggestions. So why not try our open face steak sandwich? We also have a ploughman's lunchbox. We've got the egg salad sandwich, some smoky Mexican beans on toast, or some beef quesadillas. And I think Robbie was going to suggest link to some of the recipes in the chat for us for some of these. But yeah, we have a great selection of recipes that we've created, and they're not shy of including bread and wraps and pita breads in some of these. So good suggestions to try there. So we'll pause for one final time just as I'm speaking, but as I said, we'll have some time for questions soon. But I just want to ask you what your future with bread is going to look like. So what are you actually going to consider doing differently now after hearing today's talk? Do you feel inspired? Do you feel challenged? Will you shop differently? Will you eat more mindfully? Maybe will you consider starting to take up bread baking as a form of therapy? So how will it change for you moving forward? But that's everything I wanted to present. And I want to say thanks for listening, and we'll jump into some questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Naomi. That was brilliant. I still can't get that stat out of my head. 20 million slices a day. When you said that, I thought you were going to say a year. That I can't even compute how many slices of bread that is a second being wasted. Such a shame, but super interesting. We've got loads of questions coming through. There's loads of comments in the chat, and I've started noting just a few themes coming through, particularly with the quotes and the thoughts that you went through about how people might be thinking about bread and things like that. So I think we'll get to that in a second, but we've got some good questions in the chat. So someone's just quoting that in one supermarket, there was a bread they bought as a sourdough bread, which contained molasses. And they were wondering what that would be for, which is interesting. And I think this could be a broader question as well. People are wondering about the differences between different types of bread. So I wonder if you could just touch on the use of those random, like we might consider random ingredients in traditional loaves of bread. Why would they add molasses or yeast or sugar? Why would they be using these ingredients that aren't typically seen in traditional baking?
Yeah, brilliant. As I might have mentioned, bread normally is just flour, water, salt, and a leavening agent in its most sort of raw form. You can get a bread loaf that way. But it's a great example because there is benefit to adding some flavorings in that way, even with traditional fermentation processes. And part of the reason is, remember, with sourdough, it's got that active live culture of bacteria. So not only are they feeding on the sugars in the flour, but the addition of molasses means that they're loving that sugar source from molasses as well. And it's a darker sugar derivative. So it's probably adding to maybe some of the color when baked as well. That changes the crust and the texture of the crumb. So it's an art form really when it comes to baking. Don't be afraid then if it was just molasses or something added to it, but no other sort of things you can't pronounce or preservatives that seem as part of it, then maybe it's about buying and enjoying a slice of that kind of bread and noticing, does it taste different because it's had that addition of molasses. And again, it comes down to the fermentation with sourdough is beneficial at actually breaking down a lot of the gluten, but also the sugar molecules to have less of an impact on our blood glucose levels when we eat them.
Excellent, very good. There's quite a few questions coming through around celiac disease and gluten intolerance, gluten sensitivity. And okay. I think it would be good to touch on that. So there's a few questions around how can we spot the signs? And then I think also it'd be good just to maybe touch on what else could be triggering gut symptoms that we might experience with foods that might be outside of a specific intolerance. I think that'd be good to touch on, because I think there's a bit of a spectrum we can look at when we look at gluten sensitivity, right? So yeah, I think the questions around celiac, best options for those, and then being able to spot whether you might have a form of that condition. But I mean, from my perspective, celiac is pretty black and white, right? You've either got it or you haven't, but then the gluten sensitivity topic. Anyway, that might be good just to touch on. I wonder what your thoughts are there.
Okay. So the question around how can you recognize the symptoms, but then also what are some choices of bread for those with symptoms? Is that right? Or?
Yeah, I think let's if we start with like celiac disease to start with, explaining what that is and then appropriate choices for people with that condition, and then I think moving beyond that for people that are experiencing symptoms maybe linked to IBS or gluten sensitivity, how they might be able to spot whether it is or not related to the bread or gluten or something like that. That'd be good.
Oh yeah. I mean, maybe that is tricky to summarize for everyone here, because it's going to be specific to each individual. And I guess it starts with that sort of discomfort and bloating. Maybe there's increased gas that you're experiencing. As you said, when it comes to celiac disease, that's a diagnosis done by a medical professional. So, but I think it would start with some of those initial symptoms and just get more severe. And maybe you want to keep a food diary and notice in reflection about how you're feeling, and some of those signs about like bloated stomach, extra wind, maybe feeling like you're not able to stomach it, or some of those things. And if you're keeping a food diary, you might then see a pattern that it's linked to when you eat wheat or when you're eating bread. But again, it is just personal. And yeah, a lot of people do share how bloating seems to be a symptom for them.
Yeah.
But again, I also come back to what I mentioned about, is it the types of bread you're choosing? So if you're keeping a food diary, are you looking back and noticing, are they actually more of some processed breads, ultra processed? And could you swap to maybe more of a naturally freshly baked option and see if there's any differences there? I'm not sure if either of you want to jump in with this, because it's obviously a very personal, it can be personal for each individual.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Naomi, and I think it's important to start at the point where, if you are experiencing symptoms, like going and speaking to your GP so that they can explore that with you. But like you said, Naomi, I think it can be, if it is an intolerance, for example, or you are getting symptoms that have not been diagnosed as celiac, thinking about the quantity, the quality, and like that associated with bread, but elsewhere in your diet, it's often quite easy to pin it on bread or one specific nutrient. Like we were having that conversation in the chat, whether that's bread or pasta or potatoes, and pinning it on one food and almost putting that food on a pedestal and cutting it out completely. But if we then zoom out and look at our diet as a whole, are there other ultra processed foods in our diet? And by making a shift to a diet that still includes those foods occasionally, but is based more on whole foods and including that type of, good quality bread, good quality complex carbohydrates, will we notice a shift in our symptoms by doing that? And I think for those people who can't eat gluten and do have to choose gluten-free breads, I think what I always recommend is, like you said, looking at the food label and just finding the best option. Yes, gluten-free breads might be a bit lower in fibre, they might have a bit more sugar, but it is possible to find sourdough options and whole grain options. And then what can we add to that meal? What else can we add to boost the fibre content of that meal, whether that's through veg or other things? So I think that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, brilliant. I think you're right, Tash. I think the point you made about the whole diet overlook is really important. And I think a lot of people disregard how much their psychology and their mood and mental health actually impacts their gut symptoms as well. There's really good data showing that CBT, which is a form of talking therapy, can reduce IBS-like symptoms as much as changing your diet. And if you reflect on that for a minute, that's quite remarkable. So just improving your mood and reducing stress, and that can reduce IBS-like symptoms like bloating and things like that as much as changing your diet, or as much as a FODMAP diet I saw. And we probably one for another, probably it took like one for another talk, the low FODMAP diet. But I think that was such an important point, because what you might experience when, say, you eat bread and maybe you experience symptoms, that might just be that triggering an underlying issue, which actually isn't related to the bread. There could be something else going on. So I think that was an important point. And I think I noticed earlier, there is a lot of questions coming through. And I think for a lot of them, for everyone who's asking, there's quite a lot of specific questions that were covered just in the talk. So apologies, I'm not going to go back to some of the questions that were covered in the talk. All I'd encourage you to do is reflect back on the recording, and because a lot of the questions coming through, like Naomi, is definitely covered in good detail. So, but one thing I did want to talk about, because I think it's important, something a lot of people do experience, is this all or nothing mindset, and clearly something we work on a lot at Second Nature. It's one of our earlier articles looking at thought traps and all or nothing thinking. So I think Naomi and Tash, I think it'd be good if we talk on that. There's a lot of people in the chat saying they always feel guilty when they eat bread. And yeah, we know this guilt and shame cycle related with food. So I think it will be good to talk about that. So for everyone who's still with us, who does experience all or nothing thinking, particularly around bread or other trigger foods, how would you approach that from the start?
Yeah, definitely. I don't mind jumping in first here, Naomi, because I actually made a note of this throughout your talk when I was looking at the chat, and I think that idea of I can't just have one slice was something that really stood out for me, because that could be bread, but it also can be so many different foods, can't it? And I think that can often come when we have that all or nothing mindset and we feel like those foods shouldn't be eaten, like we're doing something wrong when we have those foods. And by eating multiple slices, it's almost like, well, I need to, and just let us know in the chat if this, what I say, resonates with you. I need to get rid of it now so that I can wipe the slate clean and start afresh, and I won't have any going forward. But actually, that's not sustainable in the long term. So if we flip our mindset around, and what Naomi's talked about of how bread can be part of a balanced diet and there are no bad foods, if we flip that round and say, okay, I can have one slice today, but I can also have a slice tomorrow. I can also have a slice at lunch, and I can have a slice at my evening meal. It almost takes the power away from that food, and we don't have it on a pedestal because it's not special. We know we can have it if we really want it. Whereas if we're in the mindset of like, this is this really special food, I'm doing something wrong, I feel like I shouldn't be doing it, it creates this like horrible, yes, Lauren, guilty feeling that actually we don't need to have when we take that power away from it. It's okay to have it. I don't know if you agree, Naomi.
Oh, with everything you've just shared, absolutely. That's a mindset that is just so common. And I just wonder why bread is seen so badly and is always seems to be one of the culprits when it comes to your sort of dieting journey in this big nemesis to progress. How many people can relate to that sort of restriction entirely and then overeating later? So really what we're always trying to get at is finding that balance of enjoying it still, so that it doesn't become, as you said, put on this pedestal of something you would love to eat but can't or shouldn't, and instead just making it more of a balanced part of your meals. And sandwiches these days do tend to just be the classic double slice of bread together, and in those triangle paper packets on meal deals. So we want to suggest, could you consider like an open sandwich, thinking about ways to, as you said, enjoying a little bit and then remembering that you can have maybe some more in an evening meal with soup or beside a chili, or the next day. But I would agree with everything you shared there.
Yeah, and I think with bread as well, I think it's not unique, right? I think anything that's really tasty and really good, if we have been used to dieting in the past, whether that's bread, whether that's, like I said, potatoes or even chocolate or other things, it's that idea of, well, I've got to get rid of it because that's an enjoyable aspect. And what diets teach us is that actually it shouldn't have that enjoyable aspect. But I think what really stood out to me is at the very, very start, when everyone was sharing, people from Poland or people who are Polish or Italian, and all of that amazing sort of associations that people have with bread. And yet it's something that we automatically sort of say, well, I can't have that if my goals are related to weight and health. But absolutely, we should be having that if we want to be living a healthy lifestyle. We should be including things that, are part of our culture, bring back amazing memories for us. And actually that makes the process of change more enjoyable, which means we're going to stick to it for longer.
Yeah,
absolutely. I often think bread today is what butter was in the 1980s. It's like in the 80s, like I wasn't in the 80s, but I've like obviously read the research and seen the headlines and stuff. Like butter everyone was terrified of it, and some people still are. they were like, I can't have butter, I'll drop dead, like I can't have it. And I think, you know, with like what we've often done with these dietary guidelines and often this diet culture we've created, and Tash, you know all about that. You know, everyone wants a villain. There's got to be something because it's just easy, right? It's just an easy option rather than learning in depth about nutrition, understanding how it interacts with your body, and also from, you know, the culture's perspective, the health gurus and influencers. It's easier for them to say avoid bread's bad, rather than actually explaining the science and what Naomi's done today. Like that's what Naomi's presented today is a lot more difficult and challenging and requires more thought and practice. We could have just gone, yeah, avoid bread, terrible, raises your blood sugars, don't have it. But we're trying to provide a bit of a balanced nuance to this discussion. It's so interesting. Okay, so we're getting lots of questions, very specific questions in the chat about, is this type of bread better than the other? And I think this kind of ties into this all or nothing mindset and maybe overthinking this discussion a little bit. And I would highlight to everyone, again, recap on this webinar next week when it does come out on YouTube. But Naomi, I wonder if you could just recap. So if we're looking at the overall dietary pattern, what breads would you recommend as more commonly consumed, ones that we'd recommend consuming more often, and then ones we'd recommend maybe reducing in comparison? So choosing first, and then maybe ones that we would consider like you know, less frequently. But again, I think it does circle back to that all or nothing mindset too. We don't want to say these are good, these are bad. It's more, these are more health promoting versus these kind of situation. I wonder if you could just kind of recap that. I think everyone would really benefit.
Yeah, and I would definitely echo that caveat of the all or nothing. Because I bake sourdough myself and often use white flour for various reasons, and wholemeal and mixtures. But it does make sense that we go into a supermarket and we're buying a lot of the packaged bread options, and that's okay. If we're looking for like whole grain, wholemeal, thinking about the food label, that those flours are listed first in the ingredients. And so that would be where you'd want to be starting. You also want to consider the sourdough bread options, and then remembering, has it had just yeast added to it, and is it an authentic way of fermenting the bread and creating sourdough? So that might be the first place to start, is just considering the type of flour. But then we're also now adding just this suggestion of a lot of our breads coming from this ultra processing factory created types. And could you consider maybe more of the locally supporting a bakery or baking something for yourself? And also not forgetting that we're not talking about just a loaf of bread, but there are other options like the wraps or pita breads. And again, opting for wholemeal over white is always advisable. And I can't think of anything else to add to that, really. As you said, I have covered quite a bit of it.
Yeah.
Sure. Encourage everyone to recap that, but also remember, a lovely, fresh, crunchy French baguette, which just uses white flour and salt and water and yeast, is delicious. So I don't want to say you then can't have that. Yeah.
I always want to encourage the people, just be curious, just explore, like, how does your body respond to certain things? So a lot of people have said today, and obviously we touched on this, how they experience indigestion or gut symptoms when they eat bread, and we've said that might not be the bread itself, or it might be the type, or all these things. But we can use this information, like every time we eat, every time we exercise, every time we do something, we're sending our body a signal. And sometimes it will reply, sometimes it will say, I'm not a big fan of that. It might just be the occasion. It might just be that you have an intolerance. It might be something more sinister. But often if you see a pattern emerging with a specific type of bread, or just bread in general, flour-based products, you can use that information and say, okay, well, I always feel uncomfortable after eating this amount of bread or this specific bread. I wonder how I might feel if I swap it for this or that or something like that. It's I always encourage that curiosity,
Definitely.
Just like explore.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be, I can't eat bread because I experience this symptom. It's like, okay, I often feel this way after eating bread. So I'm actually going to eat less of it because I don't want to feel that way. And then that's a choice you're making rather than I can't eat bread. So I think there's a lot of, there's a way of approaching food which doesn't have to be restriction, where you're still maybe limiting foods that act, disproportionately to your body or whatever it is. And yeah, I just always encourage a bit of exploration. Try different things, see how much is enough in a meal. See how much is a balance. If you notice after having 2 or 3 slices of bread in one meal, you feel a bit funny after, or you're hungry an hour later, like change it, just explore and see what balance you need to experiment with.
Absolutely. And yeah, it emphasizes the idea about how bread nurtures us and that sense of mindfulness. And so we're connecting with our food more intentionally by considering the ways that it's impacting us personally and how we can work on our personalized nutrition. But using the Second Nature suggestions as a framework, as a starting point.
Absolutely. Yeah, the balanced plate model is a good place to start. Absolutely. Okay, so I think we got a few minutes left. And Natasha, I wonder, with your background in the diet culture, you've got a really good grounding in behavioral science and approaching food in the right way. I wonder if there's a final message you could give to everyone who does see food as a trigger, who does see bread as a trigger food, or is concerned about having too much bread in their diet, etc. What would you say to them?
So I actually, just before I answer that question, because it might lead on nicely, there's just a question from Athene, I hope I'm saying your name right, just mentioning, like, if the only carbs I eat in one day is from homemade sourdough bread, then how much is a good amount? And I think just answering that quickly, I'd say a couple of slices, but I wanted to hone in on the idea that, remember that you can have other sources of carbohydrates as well as that. You don't have to, just save up your carbohydrates for bread, because again, that's sort of putting that idea of the food being on a pedestal. And getting a variety of carbohydrates within your diet is beneficial as well, equally as beneficial as having a lower carbohydrate intake. So I think what I would like, my final message when it comes to enjoying bread is just thinking about, how there are no bad foods, and how zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, right? Yes, bread is a food. It's going to keep you feeling full, and it will have a physiological response in your body. But think about all the things that Naomi has talked about today, how it brings us together, how we should be enjoying foods that are part of our culture and traditions, and how that is going to make the changes that you are trying to make towards your health, whether that's weight loss, whether that's other health conditions, making sure that you're not restricting, and that you feel like, I can enjoy all foods in my diet, is actually going to be more beneficial in the long term. Because the more we tell ourselves we can't have something, the more we tell ourselves that I shouldn't be eating this bread, it's naughty, it's bad, the more it's going to be difficult to include more foods and more variety in our diet and enjoy a balanced diet. So that's what I would say. And for those people who said they were going to enjoy a hot cross bun, go and do it. Enjoy it. I'm going to do it this weekend.
Absolutely, with a slab of butter. I don't have a problem with saying. Yeah, I think it's so true, Tash. It's the cruel twist of human psychology, where the more you try and suppress something from your mind, the easier access you have to that thought, whether it's saying I can't eat this, or I can't do that. The more you say that to yourself, the more that thought will become prominent in your mind. So yeah, it's a cruel twist, but that's why we have this message at Second Nature, like, everything can be enjoyed. You can enjoy, it's like the word and, not or. It's not either or. It's not bread or weight loss. It's bread and weight loss. It's bread and health. It's bread and hot cross buns on a Sunday, or on Easter Sunday with some butter on it. You can still have a nice balanced meal after that as well, no problem. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Tash. I think that was a really good point to close. Naomi, have you got anything to finish on before we close today?
Not really. I think we've covered so much just in the question and answers, and also everyone's contributions in the chat. And I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to really read back through it because there was a lot to cover. But thank you so much for everyone's contribution there, because it's always so helpful to support one another in these sessions as well, and seeing everyone sharing about perhaps their culture or their experiences with some of these mindsets or statements that you've said. Just really reminds you that you're not alone in this journey, and that we are community. And so you're obviously here because you're perhaps just as passionate about bread and want to find a solution to having it in your life in a balanced way. So I really hope today was helpful. And yeah, that if you have any other questions, that the health coaches will be there to support you as well. But hopefully a lot has been covered today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Tash. I'm going to stop recording now. And yeah, just a reminder to everyone,